A big welcome to the authors, Swati Jaina and T.N. Hari, and of course, the moderator for the session, Manisha Matthews. So, as I was saying, Manisha has over 20 years of experience in the best of organizations, apart from Sage Publications, of course. And she is an alumnus of St. Stephen's College and Symbiosis. And she's at present also a doctoral student at SMC Switzerland. And I now hand over the session to Manisha to take it forward.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Sulakshana, and happy to be here. So before we kickstart the book discussion, let me just introduce our distinguished authors. So Swati Jaina is a quintessential all-rounder, risk-taker, always curious and observant. Founder for Write For, she's an XLRI alumna, TEDx speaker and LinkedIn top voice. A divergent thinker, she's the kind of person who makes one go, aha, I never looked at it this way. Swati is a truth teller and says it as she sees it. Swati's first book was The Entrepreneur's Soul Book, Is It Your Cup of Tea? Welcome, Swati. T.N. Hari is an engineer and an MBA from IIT Madras and IIM Calcutta. He wears different hats: author, angel investor, advisor to founders, VCs, mentor at startup accelerators, columnist, and he's also the CHRO of Big Basket, among others. Hari has played an active role in shaping the startup ecosystem in the country and is respected as a thought leader and an influencer. Hari spent the last 2 decades as part of leadership teams of high-growth startups, all 5 of which achieved successful exits, including a listing on NASDAQ. He has co-authored 7 books, some of them being Saying No to Jugaad, Pony to Unicorn, and of course, the book that we are going to talk about today. So welcome, Hari. I think this is diversity, inclusion, equity is like the hot topic among all corporates. And no better time to have written a book on this topic, and no better time to have a discussion about this book. So this is the book. And I have some questions for you, Hari and Swati, and even though I have specific questions for each of you, but please feel free to come in at any time when you want to answer any of the questions that I ask. So let's start, right? So Hari, my first question is to you. So in your book, and Swati's book, you take head on the 2015 report by McKinsey, which makes a business case for diversity. So why did you think that was necessary, taking them, head on? And were you worried that, once the book is published, there would be a lot of backlash, from maybe not from McKinsey, but from, others who read the book?
Absolutely not worried about any kind of backlash, I think, because both of us, Swati and me, have believed in speaking our mind. Because unless you speak your mind on an important topic like this, the nuances will never be understood. So I think the report has the pretense of data, but is in reality superficial, misleading, and lacking in rigor. And the problem that we have with such unsubstantiated conclusions is that it encourages those who oppose diversity to also resort to similar false arguments. So you cannot fight a faulty construct with another faulty construct, or you can't explain a mystery by proposing another mystery. So I think the conclusions were very, very misleading. So I think it gave them a great consulting opportunity by telling them, diversity is a great thing, because that was the, topic in town. Every company wanted to do something about it. So and McKinsey latched on to this and tried to find business in this. So for instance, just take several other studies. For example, Eileen Lee. She wrote an article in TechCrunch after studying about 39 unicorns. And that was the report in which the word unicorn actually was coined and used for the first time. Right. And everyone has latched on to that. In that, she found that in all the unicorns, the diversity in the founding team was very low. But she was intellectually honest and smart enough not to generalize and conclude that if you have low diversity, you can build unicorns. Similarly, Michael Holmes, a professor at one of the US universities, had made a study where he reached some kind of a conclusion that, or he observed some data to show that women CEOs tend to deliver lower financial performance than men CEOs. But then he dived a little deeper and found out that the companies that women were running were always run poorly, in the sense that they were financially poor performers even before the women took over. And women were therefore women CEOs like Mary Barra and Melissa Mayer or even Carly Fiorina were handed out poorly performing companies in terms of financials. But he was smart enough to pick that up and didn't conclude that women CEOs deliver lower financial results. So I think it's important to call these things out, because anything which presents a subject wrongly, even if the intended outcome is correct, actually is not correct, because then it allows the opposing camp, those who are opposing diversity, to also use such tactics and misleading reports and conclusions to say that diversity isn't good. So that's the reason why we took them on, because people have to clearly understand that what McKinsey was saying was not right, and that's not a reason to support diversity at all. That's not the real reason. You should support diversity for the real reasons.
Absolutely, completely agree with you. And in fact, a lot of companies, there is evidence to show that because they wanted to say that we have more women in the senior management or on the board, they give them glass cliff roles, the kind of roles that you're talking about, where they are made CEOs or whatever, but they fail because the companies anyway were run badly. So completely agree with you. Yes,
I want to add something to that very quickly. And as Hari rightly said, that both of us felt it was important to call these out, and our objective is not so much a McKinsey or a Unilever, many other case studies we have taken up.
Yes.
The point is to say that these are the best among class, right?
Yes.
And this is a larger call to introspection to the system to say that the problem is far more complex than we give it credit for. And somewhere we'll have to step away from this pressure of, posing ourselves as experts, whether as leaders or as organizations, and, just raise a hand and say, we are figuring it out, right? And the whole point of taking up a McKinsey or, any of the best-in-class organizations is to just, call out the need for introspection. So that's something that I would like to add.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I think McKinsey is continued on this line, because they came out with another report later on, which kind of builds on this one. And so, okay. So Swati, my next question is to you. But before that, I just, you have this very interesting section in your book, which says discrimination is the very basis of management.
Yeah.
So before I ask the question, if you could just read out an excerpt from that section.
Sure.
Thank you.
And a very counterintuitive point, I agree. So I'm just going to read some parts of that section. So discrimination is the very basis of management. This idea might seem preposterous on the face of it. However, a close look into how organizations discriminate at every stage will establish that far from being preposterous, this is actually a fact we all accept and live by. In many job posts, we find organizations outrightly mention Tier 1 or Ivy League schools, colleges only, denying anyone outside the bucket to even try. That's discrimination. But it's also a hiring strategy which is considered normal. For example, top investment banks only hire the top students of top colleges, even get a chance to try. Who is to say that someone with a lower score in those top colleges or one studying in a lower rung college will not make a top investment banker? Compensation is another form of discrimination. A premier college graduate is offered a higher pay than his colleague from a lower rung college for the same job. That's discrimination. And it's not only accepted, but becomes a reason for millions of youngsters and their parents aspire to make it to these premier colleges. Now, one might argue that these are examples of differentiation more than discrimination. There's only a fine line between the two in many cases. For example, the startup world is rife with murmurs of entrepreneurs anguished about investors having a pedigree bias, that an IITian or the like may find initial funding easier than someone outside the Ivy League. Inside conversations, many investors may agree to it, their rationale being that initial bet is made on the entrepreneur. They opine that while pedigree may not be the only deciding factor, it's considered a proxy indicator for capability and ability to go through the grind. To some, this may seem like a case of differentiation. To others, it may be education-based discrimination. Getting lost in semantics is therefore both futile and non-productive to our goal. What is necessary to acknowledge is the principle that while discrimination has become a bad word, it's the very algorithm by which people, whether employees or customers, are managed. The corollary to this principle is that equality cannot or should not be expected of organizations, given the nature of business. This brings us to the concept of fairness, which is often used inaccurately to mean equality. Both are not the same. Organizations are increasingly put in the dock for seeking to hire certain demographic profiles, pay differentially, etc. In other words, they are expected to practice equality. Differentiating between the need for organizations to be equal as opposed to being fair becomes critical. We cannot expect organizations to be equal, but we can expect them to be fair. And here lies the key to dealing with discrimination in organizations. Organizations cannot be non-discriminatory. What they must strive for is to discriminate using fair and transparent principles.
Yeah, so the question is that, so how does an organization discriminate using fair and transparent?
Transparent, yeah.
Yeah.
There are a whole lot of very specific case studies that follow, this segment in the book. So I'll mention a few, which, will help me answer your question. So for example, one of the much, discussed discrimination is against women, right? And, as women, a lot of us, if not all, would have faced some variation of the question of when are you planning to start a family? And if you're not married, then, around when are you planning to get married, right? And there's a lot of hue and cry on these questions being discriminatory, right?
Yeah.
And we all know that there is a certain cultural ethos we live in, right? And that has not changed. The conversation is progressing, mindsets are changing, but that entire shift will take probably another generation, to be fair, right? So it is true. And I can tell you that even in Premier, Ivy League, right? A lot of my batchmates got married to each other, right? It may still happen, depending on the case, that if the guy has to take a transfer and he got a better opportunity, the other person will also take a transfer because they want to live together, and then their career might take a back seat for a while, right? And this being, Ivy League, so the trend still continues. So is it wrong for employers to ask? Which is where we get into, being fair, but being transparent, right? So what I'm saying essentially is we need to recognize the context, right? There is no point denying and saying that today we'll wake up and everything is equal. No, we live in a context. So I gave another example. When I was in an HR role, there was a hiring manager who confided me in, and he said that he is avoiding hiring female engineers, and that's blasphemy, right?
Yeah.
But I can vouch for a fact that he was not a misogynist. The team was under tremendous pressure. There was hiring freeze for months. There was no backfill. His team was already overworked.
Yes.
We were not the best payers in the category. So any job role would take 7-8 months to fill, right? In that situation, his rationale was, if the person went for maternity leave, the very, very, typical case study, my already under pressure team will, their back will break, right? Yes. Was it the most elegant solution? No. But was the organization supporting him? No, right? So in these situations, what can organizations do? One, acknowledge the larger problem. B, they do more than just giving a top-down mandate to hiring managers. That don't be discriminatory. Also, teach them objective ways of asking the question, and then don't just ask the question to women, ask it to men. And have a clear and open policy that we have a role, it's going to be demanding, and whoever comes on to this role for the next 1 or 2 years, we would like them to be able to, work continuously in that. Is that fair? Yes. So I hope this, demonstrates what I mean by being fair and transparent rather than
absolutely. Yeah, beautifully explained. And, that's why also I think organizations end up doing tokenism in the name of diversity, because they are not aware of how to go about this thing. So they want to be diverse, they want to be inclusive, they want to be equitable, but they really don't know exactly how to go about it. So then someone tells them that these are some things that you must do. And so they go ahead and do those, and those actually end up looking like tokenism. So yeah, completely agree with you. So Hari, my next question is to you, Hari. So in the chapter, does diversity really help business? You mentioned that diversity in your employment practices should at least mirror, if not better, the diversity in the communities you serve or the talent pools you draw from, right? So within the context of India, my question is that we are anyway a very diverse nation, and is our problems are slightly different from the West. So we have a lot of diversity in the sense of caste and religion and everything. So compared to the West. So, how do Indian organizations go about doing this?
So I think as while I respond to this, I would also request Swati to chip in, because we may not have discussed this specific topic and reached a common agreement on this. So I think, D&I is an extremely complex and sensitive topic. And throughout history, nations have resorted to violence, and resistance to this idea of diversity has been the cause of violence and even wars. If you just look at every war, it's about intolerance towards some form of diversity. So I think it's an extremely complex subject, and we need to, treat this path with a lot of sensitivity and care. In my opinion, if you want to understand diversity based on religion and caste and do something about it, you need a deep understanding of sociology, history, and progress on these two areas before doing something about it. And I don't think people in corporates deeply understand enough to be able to do something about diversity, leave alone taking affirmative actions when it comes to religion and caste. I think gender diversity is something that is easily understood by everyone, far more prevalent. All of us encounter lack of equality when it comes to gender. All of us experience it. For instance, every family has a woman. It can be a daughter, it can be a wife. I have a daughter, I have a wife. So I experience that, I sense that. But not all of us are interacting. Not all of us know what castes the other people belong to, what religions other people belong to, and what are the sensitivities. So we're not faced or touched by those things. My only, submission on something like this is that companies must embrace inclusion wholeheartedly. And when you embrace inclusion wholeheartedly, then you will never explicitly, differentiate or discriminate based on these two things, which is caste and gender. Also, caste and religion. So I think when it comes to diversity and inclusion, there are two components. One is, I would say, capability building and affirmative actions. The other is being very inclusive. So I think when it comes to gender diversity, companies must do all three, which is being completely honestly inclusive, as well as create capability and take affirmative actions. When it comes to diversity based on religion and caste, I think inclusion, being wholeheartedly inclusive, is the best way of dealing with it. Affirmative actions and other ways, I don't think corporates are equipped to even deal with it. It can create a lot more controversy, and it's best left to social reformers to bring about the change, create capability. Best left to governments to figure out what is the best way to overcome some of the baggage that's there on these two aspects. That's the way I would look at it, Manisha. I'd like Swati to add, because this is my view.
I agree with you, Hari. And in fact, probably point out that we'll have to be sensible and draw the line somewhere, because if you start looking at how many categories you can look at diversity and inclusion across, it can be, you'll have caste, you'll have religion, you will have language. Particularly if you're talking of India, just if you were to make an Excel sheet of parameters, it'll be endless. So I think somewhere we have to define the problem statement in a sensible and doable way.
Right.
And as the last point that Hari said, I think when diversity and inclusion, and we've mentioned that in the book also, the last chapter, Rewiring for Diversity, focuses on that, is that, we talk of it only in terms of corporates, and that too, the large corporates, right? Diversity and inclusion is a larger social problem. So the academic systems need to be part of it. Hari mentioned social reformers, government policies, right? So somewhere when all these big, so it's like in corporates, we say, can we solve the world hunger problem? It's a very important thing, and corporates play a very important role because they're taking part of the employment, the financial independence part of it, right? They have a very important role to play, but they cannot play that role alone. So somewhere, some of these issues have to be, discussed at an ecosystem level, bringing the other subsystems together.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Hari made an important point there, and in your book also, at some place you mentioned it, that, even the education system for that matter, when we come to, management schools, there is a lacuna in terms of education. So sociology, history are very important subjects. While we study them at school, we also need to have some bit of it in the, post-graduation or graduation level as well, because you are actually not dealing with a very important part of education, which actually, the sociology of the being, it has to be something that has to be discussed in management education as well. So yeah, very, very important point there for management education. And okay, so the next question I'll go to, which is for both of you, Hari and Swati. So in your book, you keep referring to diversity advocates, feminists, and diversity enthusiasts. So you keep referring to these names. I want to know, you both have written this book on diversity. So what do you call yourself? So,
Hari, you want to go first?
Yeah. No, you go first.
To be very honest, never really thought of this until this point in time that it was asked on what do you definitely none of the words that you
okay.
And definitely not expert, and we have very clearly stated in the preface that we couldn't have written this book if we thought of ourselves as experts. I would say curious observers, and the fact that diversity is everyone's business. We made it our business as well, to look at the thing, to see what is not making sense, and just ask the relevant questions. So I think that's the only word that I would like to use on how I would describe myself in this equation.
Right. Yes, Hari.
Yeah, I think maybe I would describe myself as an evangelist when it comes to inclusion. And maybe over the years, I have become a bit of a feminist, which is that a supporter of women's causes, helping create gender equality. I think that has become a bit of a passion with me. So I would say an evangelist for inclusion and a bit of a feminist.
Okay, awesome. Okay. Swati, there is this chapter in which you talk about women wanting to be sampann, meaning having it all, right? So, while reading that chapter, I thought, aren't men also wanting to be sampann? It's a human desire, right? We all want to have it all. So why would you only refer to women wanting to be sampann, and the rest of the chapter you talk about it like that? So
yeah. So I'll explain the context in which sampann has been mentioned. So basically, the context of sampann is to challenge the construct and premise that is typically used for women, that women are necessarily perfectionists, and you see this very this rhetoric in popular media a lot, right? So women don't raise their hand in meetings or don't ask for a seat in the table because they feel inadequate, because they have some innate tendency to be perfectionist. So like there are books based on it, which picked up and mentioned in the chapter as well, right? So I was challenging that premise and saying that in my experience, I know plenty of women who are not necessarily perfectionists, but what probably could be a better construct for research, right, was more a suggestion that even keeping aside cultural differences, somewhere women are raised to be more sampann. So sampann, as opposed to being perfectionist, is multitaskers, right? So they can take care of the work outside, whether it's rural woman working in the field, or an urban woman going to the office and working and earning money for the family, or typically taking care of themselves. So we tend to raise women to be more self-sufficient. So it is the chapter doesn't really talk in terms of sampann is a woman's ambition per se, but what it says is typically and traditionally we've raised women to be sampann, right? And what it says is, so there's no change required, because that probably gives us better survival skills, that probably makes us more self-sufficient, right? Whether it's emotionally, whether it's taking care of ourselves. Perhaps when we talk of change of gender roles, the only shift we could take is we could start raising our boys that ways as well, right? So not just raise them to be successful in their careers, but be able to cook a meal and do the chores, and be able to suppress their vulnerabilities. Even that is another area, right? So that is the context in which Sampan has been mentioned.
Right. I mean, obviously we have to raise our boys that way, and I remember this conversation in our office some time ago where one boy was talking about how he was leaving the organization, going to study somewhere, and he's like, the only problem is I don't know how I will eat, what I will eat, and how will I take care of those needs. So, the another woman pointed out that you will cook and eat, right? So he said, I don't cook. So she said, then how did you survive all this while? Like, you can't survive without cooking. I mean, you need to know that, right?
Yeah.
So it came out very naturally from her. Like, she was really surprised at how could a man this old say that I don't know how to cook. Like, if you have to feed yourself, you better know how to cook.
Yeah.
So I think that's absolutely essential that we teach our boys that these are survival skills, and you need to know how to clean, you need to know how to cook, and this is not just for women. So I mean, that's a long debate, but yeah, just reminded
maybe
me.
I'd just like to add
Yes.
a couple of sentences to this, which is, I think, in some ways, Sampan, when it comes to, I mean, the point that you made is that everyone, including the men, may want to be complete. But I think when it comes to men, I think it's a bit of a choice, which is they have a choice whether to be complete or focus at work and not be great at the home front.
Yes.
But when it comes to women, I think it's an imposition, which is society has created the concept of Sampan, Sargun Sampan, which is an imposition, which is clearly to keep them in check and or put certain boundaries that you need to be a good mother, you need to be a good husband, you need to do all of these things well. So I think it's a bit of an imposition which has over centuries maybe psychologically impacted women, so that as a result of which they are not able to take away the fact that they can be great at something and need not be good at everything else.
Absolutely. The Sargun Sampan tag is only for women. Like, it's never said for men, right? Like, so if you are looking for a bride, you would say that in your ad or whatever, but not the other way around. So it is supposed to be only women who have all the qualities, not men. So
it's very interesting during COVID, and when there were all this talk of women now being even more overworked, right? There's someone who had posted on LinkedIn saying, we need to be empathetic for the women employees and give them more breaks to take care of household chores. And I reminded, well, another solution is men could also start doing their share of household chores, right? Yes. So I completely agree with Hari that there is a social conditioning also that has happened in some way. It's also a vicious cycle. So I think one is to change our conditioning to say that, both can have that choice, that Hari very rightly mentioned, that perhaps men have more of a choice, and for women, something is naturally chosen for them. So one, that will change. But as we also make men more capable, we have seen that in our homes, like for our dads, the previous generation, etc. Now it's too late. I don't even know how to do it, right? So as we, equip them with skills, I think that transition will become more easier.
Yes. So, there are women of older generation who will say that, life is much harder for you, like for people my generation. Will say, तुम लोगों को सब करना पड़ता है. You have to go out and work. You have to work at home. You have to rear kids. Everything. For us, it was easier because we only did household work, right? So it's become more tough. So what have you gotten with this equality? Like you made your life difficult. But that's the funny part of it. But okay. Let me go on to the next question. So Swati, this one's for you. So you talk about in your equality chapter about equal, not same. So now this whole diversity debate has moved on to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it is DEI now, and everybody is talking about it. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting and pertinent question, because there are a couple of things I want to point out. One is when we say that the conversation has moved on, typically we are becoming better at rhetoric, right? So new words and new terminology, and maybe we as we are sharing our understanding across the world, maybe understanding is also advancing, right? But that does not necessarily mean the conversation has really progressed, right? So when so that's one. So to say that the conversation has now moved from equality to DEI, Do we have a shared understanding of what equality means? Not necessarily, right? So there are cultural differences as well. There are societies that are more egalitarian, right? In our society, if I just take gender because gender is perhaps slightly easier to understand.
Yes.
If I take gender, what is equality between two genders? That itself is not a shared understanding. If we are used to a very hierarchical understanding, right? As long as a woman is treated nicely and she's given the opportunity, etc., she might think that's equal. Right, but it may not be equal. If another woman, her right to voice her opinion, to challenge things, that is what the definition of equality might be, right? So I don't think that we are. It will take us a long time to even have a shared understanding of what equality means, for that to translate into mindset,
Yes.
and then to move on. Now, equity, right? So I don't see equity as something different or even a progression from equality. Equity is a step to equality, right? Like in the book we've spoken about affirmative action,
Yes.
or for that matter using a card, like a woman card or a race card, and how sometimes that could be a thing that helps you bridge that delta, as long as it is defined, transparent, etc., right? So equity is a step to equality. It's a necessary a thing that we should do to reach equality. So I don't think it's a question of the conversation having moved at all. So that's how I look at it.
Right. So, I mean, there is this very famous feminist who actually recently passed away, Kamala Bhasin. I'm sure you also have heard of her. So there is this, instance where she's talking to some rural women and talking about how, from her feminist perspective, she's talking about how men and women can be equal and can work together, and all of those things. So it is said that one of those women got up and said that I don't want to be equal to my husband.
Wow.
Because he's someone who drinks every night and comes and beats me or whatever. I don't want to be like him. I want to be equal to you. You are someone who's educated. Yeah. So I want to be like you. So everybody's definition of equality is also different. So when we are saying equality, we don't mean that, that woman should be equal to her husband who's absolutely no good, So completely, agree with you there. And I think we have a long road ahead of us to equality and equity. And in this country, in a country like India, I think the disparity is so large that it is going to take us a lot of work to get there.
I would just like to take a quick 10 seconds also, because what you mentioned about a country, and there's a lot of these reports and World Economic Forum reports that typically apparently India is in a bad state. One thing is very important also to understand the cultural ethos of a place. So sometimes I feel when we have these conversations, there seem to be some very blanket statement, right? But it's very important to go deep and understand the context of what is equal, what is not. Just because it is not equal, does it mean it is unfavorable and discriminatory? So I feel that we particularly when we map countries to it, and I've seen India being mapped not favorably in a lot of places, and I felt that the context was missing. So I think that's very important thing. So just wanted to find that out.
Yes. So Swati, just to because all corporates are not talking about diversity, and this is such a hot topic. Let's say, I'm just putting in a hypothetical question. Let's say a CEO of an organization comes to you and says that I want my organization to be D&I compliant, and how do I do it? So what would be, what would you tell her? How would you guide her?
Sure. And I'd be very curious to know Hari's answer to this.
Yes,
as well. But let me take the bait first.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is what the CEO would expect of me, but as I see it, if I am given the responsibility to make the organization diverse and inclusive, it's very important for me to understand where does the leader stand on it, right? And what are their personal convictions? So, and what is it that they are willing to change in themselves, right? Because one of the things that is not spoken about, like hardly spoken about, right, is a leader's mindset. And if you see, so much is leader driven. Like you've spoken about dissent at length, right?
Yes.
It is so so leader driven. If the leader does not believe in it, there's no way, anything meaningful is going to happen in the organization. This whole thing of tokenism, right? It really boils down to the leader's conviction. Second, the courage to say that I don't know, but I'm willing to learn and find out. Right? And the commitment, because it demands a lot of commitment of time and thinking from the leader to say, where I'm taking my business and therefore what diversity means for it, right? A person like me in the hypothetical role that you assign me, our role would be to ask those questions to enable those, right? But if you say, what is the first thing I'll start with the leader.
Okay, great. Yes, Hari.
Yeah, so I think this is an extremely complex thing because driving change or change management of any kind is not easy. So I think it's very difficult to take positions that, unless there is a deep belief in diversity or inclusion, we are not going to do this. I'll give you a real example. So at Big Basket, for example, right, the way we've approached diversity and inclusion. Is this company completely open to diversity? Are there women in the top management? Answer is no. There are no women in the top management. Is this completely open to diversity? I don't think so. Yeah. But I think we started at a particular pace and I saw continuous change happening gradually through education. People began understanding the power of diversity. It was a slow journey, but it began to happen. And diversity and inclusion happens at multiple levels. It's not just one level. And those multiple levels, for example, implementing a prevention of sexual harassment policy in a company with 35,000 people spread across different parts of the country with 80% in the blue collar category and women in the blue collar category, being able to implement it flawlessly and creating the fear of God in every part of the company that you cannot do something and get away. Yes. And even the management team understanding this and will not be able to get an exception to this, I think is great movement. And I think we've taken some principles about, doing the right things first. So I think you can make change provided the leadership is open. They may not be completely, coming from a background of inclusion and diversity. They may not understand the nuances. I think if you need a bit of education. You will not be successful every day. It will be a bit of a slow journey. But I've seen this at Big Basket happen, and I'm very happy to talk about it in detail on some other day.
And it's become much harder now, isn't it, with all this virtual workplaces? Because when you had everybody in your offices under one roof, it would have been easier, right? Do you think so? Or, it is still as easy to do it if you were working together in an office space? What do you think?
Remote working has had its positives and negatives. It has impacted the way people work and engage. I'm not very sure how it has impacted our approach to diversity and inclusion. I really don't have a point of view on whether it's affected it negatively. My own sense is that I would stay neutral on this. I don't have data to suggest anything either way.
Okay, so my next question is to you, Hari, and most of your book is talking about gender diversity, and even we see that in corporates also most of the talk is around, it starts and ends with gender diversity. So are you worried that this will just stay at gender diversity and we will not explore more about generational, racial, ethnic, all the other forms of diversity?
See, I think, that's a very good question. On reading the book, one might tend to get the feeling that there is a lot of emphasis on gender diversity. But just look at the other points that Swati mentioned and the questions that you asked: equality but not equal, equity, and the point about dissent as being a very important foundational element of diversity. I don't think is discussed anywhere. Discrimination and diversity is not discussed anywhere. So we've chosen to pick the predominant dimension around which diversity is critical, which is gender. And there are hundreds of other dimensions. It can be caste, religion, race, age. There's so many other things. But I think, adding those nuances is not going to change the quality of the book. The quality of the book, to my mind, got really, dramatically improved because we were able to bring in the less discussed elements of diversity, which is dissent. How important is dissent? I think you should read the chapter on dissent and diversity. It's so powerful. You cannot get anything done if you cannot implement any other diversity initiative If
Right.
you're not open to dissent, that is so foundational. We've discussed this at great length. We've
Yes.
talked about the idea of woke washing and how, companies like Hindustan Unilever, great companies on many other dimensions, are also doing, such things as to just change the name of the brand from Fair and Lovely to, Glow and Lovely. Who are they cheating? So I think we've talked about these things at length, that how brands are woke washing, being very tokenist in terms of their approaches. So my own sense, and I'm not trying to, say that it's great because we've written this, but we just felt that gender diversity was important, and all these surrounding things which are less discussed was very important to bring out and help people understand. And you can extend some of these principles to other components of, dimensions of diversity around age. We have briefly mentioned age and a few other things as well.
Right.
Yeah. In fact, I just add one more thing as well, and Hari said it perfectly. So, just an added point is, even where we have spoken of gender diversity, some areas, right? It is also spoken of in a way to lead organizations to think beyond that. So, for example, when you talk of the pay gap between men and women, right?
Yeah.
I think the gender parameter shows up most prominently, right? So when they say you have that the pregnancy penalty, right? You come back and you get paid less. But if you look at data, generally, particularly Indian corporates have a mindset against any kind of break. Right, even for men, right? But that might be a much smaller number, and someone has to look carefully at that data, right? So any kind of gap, we can suspect will be penalized. But this is the data point that shows up most prominently. So even when we are looking at gender diversity, the call is to look beyond that and see what other problems it can lead us to find out that we haven't really included in the definition.
Right. So, Dr. Sulakshana, I think we are out of time now. So, I think we can wrap up, or?
Yes. In fact, before we wrap up, I must say a very, very interesting and an important conversation that we had. And while we started off with the corporate sector this time, I'm hoping that we can extend it to all spheres, be it education, be it even the family, for that matter. And hopefully in the next LitFest, Sage will give us more publications.
Right.
Nonetheless, thank you so much, Mr. T.N. Hari. Thank you so much, Ms. Swati Jena, for your contributions, your insights, observations, and analysis. And thank you so much, Manisha, not only just for steering this entire conversation, but the emails that we've been exchanging over the last so many days, and the working down to the nitty-gritties and everything. So thank you so much, everyone. Wonderful, wonderful session. Very, very important conversation.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thanks
it's a pleasure having all of you here as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sen and Manisha.